French Revolution, Chapter 19, Part 2. In this 18 slides, we are going to talk about how the French Revolution finally subsides. Beginning with slide number 19, war intensifies unrest and dissatisfaction. With a war going, the Girondins are trying to spread the French Revolution across Europe. The property classes are going to rebel a little bit. They supported the revolution, but not the new government. They wanted to move ahead with the revolution, but they don't like the new Girondin government. In their eyes, the government was still run by an elite. And so on August 10th, the Tuileries was stormed. The Tuileries were government buildings. And when that happens, it's kind of like the Bastille again. The old Constitution was abrogated, meaning it was thrown out and no longer used. A new constitution was going to be created. A new constitutional convention was called with universal suffrage as a main goal. And this is going to be one of the things that happens because of the French Revolution is we do get more people voting than ever, including women. In September of that year, September massacres killed some of the nobles in France. And this is going to be kind of the start of when it really gets ugly. I'll say similar to, politics in America this year where we had riots and we had, militias and things kind of roaming around. What happens in France is the nobles are the hated class. And so some radicals are going to take things into their own hands and start killing nobles. And that is a picture, by the way, of Versailles today. So this would be the way it looks from the air. And I have been to Versailles twice. Really cool place. Let's look at the key players. Number one is going to be Maximilien Robespierre. He is the number one guy of the revolution. And he was kind of a radical. He was the first. He's going to be the one that calls for executions. So again, probably the most radical. Georges Danton and Jean Marat were also leaders of the Jacobins. So all three of those were Jacobins. Remember, that is the first of the clubs to take over. And now things are swinging more toward the Girondins. And there you get a picture of Danton and Robespierre. We'll show you Marat later. The National Convention met on 9/20/1792. The revolution spread in the wake of successful French armies. You have a corporal who is rising to great things in the army, becoming a well-known leader and especially very good with strategy and things. And of course, that's Napoleon. And by the time it's all done, he will become a general, but he starts as just a corporal. And the French army is successful out in the fields. The weakness of the coalition, though, is what saved France. A coalition meaning a bunch of countries banding together. And what happens is the coalition was weak, and when things started going bad, they dropped out one by one. This is also the year of the first partition of Poland. And that is another thing that helped to save France at this time is Austria, Prussia, Russia were all more concerned with getting a piece of Poland than of defeating the French. And right there is Napoleon on horseback. Yes, that's supposed to be funny. Now a third group arises in the French Revolution called the Montagnards. That's a French word meaning mountain. And they became a new group within the revolution. Popular revolutionists outside the convention called themselves sans-culottes. You guys know what culottes are? They are kind of a pants that they wear that are capris, I think you'd call them today. You show basically the ankle. It comes halfway up the shin. And sans means without. So culottes is what the kind of rich and nobles wore. People without culottes were the poor. Their militancy pressed the revolution on for 2 years. So they become very militant, in other words, wanting to see blood, wanting revenge, wanting to clean things up. And Louis XVI is going to be put on trial for treason in December of 1792. And there's a picture of the sans-culottes. Louis XVI is executed, so he becomes the second monarch, great monarch of Europe to be executed by his people. His execution meant that the Bourbons couldn't be restored to power, or you'd have the same thing that you had with the Stuarts in England, and that is if people were still alive that put the Bourbon king to death, then they would be hunted down later and executed, or their families would. And so, the decision is made, we can't put a Bourbon back on the throne. Those that had him killed would be executed themselves if they returned to power. And so they, meaning the Bourbons, if the Bourbons returned to power. And here is the famous painting showing execution of Louis XVI. And what they often did with this guillotine is they would chop the head off, and then it fell into a basket, and somebody would pull the head out of the basket and run around with it and dripping blood and show people. The French armies are driven from Belgium. So we have the first bad news now in the Girondin attempt to spread the revolution worldwide, or at least European-wide. And so losses on the battlefield and poor economics fueled the revolutionary fire. Girondin leaders who pushed war were now arrested or fled. Many of them actually are going to leave the country. The Mountain now led the assembly, the Montagnards. By the way, they got their name because in the parliamentary hall, they usually sat up on the top. There were 2 floors. So you got the ground floor where the usually the monarch was, or the what we would call, the Speaker of the House. And then up on top, you had higher seats. And the people that the Montagnards group, they all sat up on the top. And so when they stood, people said it kind of looked like a mountain. There were counter-revolutionary forces existing outside Paris and within. Remember, there is a group of Catholic nuns and monks. The monks are going to be the leaders in this. But there's a group that is loyal to Rome yet, and they're counter-revolutionary. So you have groups trying to get the revolution to stop, as well as you have groups trying to get the revolution to push forward. Robespierre pushed the means of suppressing counter-revolution. So Robespierre, one of the leaders, he wants the revolution to keep going. And how do you suppress counter-revolution? You start executing those that are trying to get things back to the way they were. Okay? And this is a picture here of, again, their armed masses bringing in some person that is a counter-revolutionary, and then he goes on trial. So the convention sets up the Reign of Terror. The Reign of Terror, one of the worst times in history of the world for bloodshed, and especially kangaroo courts. Enemies of the revolution were arrested, and 40,000 heads were chopped off. So if you were against the revolution, you were suspect. You could be brought to court, and if they found you guilty, you could be put in jail and then eventually have your head chopped off. The Committee of Public Safety operated as a joint dictatorship and war cabinet. So they pushed the war, and they were basically running the country as dictators. One of their biggest and most unpopular deeds was to enact a levy en masse to gain soldiers, in other words, a draft. And it put strict economic controls out to help the struggling government succeed. So they put out price controls, things to keep prices from raising too high, and to limit what you could buy and sell and all that kind of thing. And so here's a picture of some of the enemies of the revolution being thrown in jail and getting visitors. The thing is, many of the jails at the time did have windows and that kind of thing, so you could look out and sometimes talk to people who were in jail. A Republican constitution was adopted in June of 1793 to make France a republic. And a republic really refers to you're going to have a leader, you're going to have a Congress, and they are going to make laws. So a Republican form of government does have some democracy in it. And it created universal managed suffrage. Universal means women could vote. And while that's going to be taken away, for a time, women could vote in France. France becomes really the first country to allow women to vote. Slavery in the French colonies is abolished. Slavery was growing very unpopular at the time, so they got rid of slavery in the French colonies. France was de-Christianized, meaning no longer considered to be a Catholic country. The church is no longer supported and revered. Instead, they adopt something called the cult of the supreme being. And this is kind of deism, which is the belief that there is a God and he created the universe, but then he sits back like the intelligent watchmaker and watches it work. And now we have our fourth group, the Hébertists. The Hébertists became ultra-revolutionaries. So, this is, if you want to use modern terms, this is like, okay, the ISIS of the Muslims. There are many Muslims, that want revolution, they want change, but many of them aren't willing to go so far as to kill people. And then you got ISIS, which will do anything. The Hébertists become those. And this is a famous painting of the time, just showing, supposed to be showing liberty and the fact that the cult of the supreme being here, these people are like angels that, in heaven. It's supposed to be a symbolic thing showing the cult of the supreme being. You notice they are all people. You can't tell us, but they're people from the revolution. Military success made people less willing to put up with controls. France had the largest army ever in Europe. And people became fed up with the dictatorship, and they got fed up with the economic regimentation. Okay? Similar to what we're going through with the pandemic. And then Danton dies, and there was a fear of the ruling committee. Danton was kind of the people's voice. He was the steady one, and he is actually going to be put to death by the guillotine. And when that happens, now there's fear, especially with Robespierre still around. So Robespierre and his associates went to the guillotine next because of pressure from the working class radicals. So they kind of decided to get rid of all of the old ruling class. And Robespierre, who created the guillotine, and he didn't invent the guillotine, but he created the use of the guillotine for these executions. He's going to go to the guillotine too. And they believed they were pressing the revolution further, the working class radicals. What you really get here now, the working class, the working man, the blue collar people, they're the ones pushing the revolution. And they think that they can, still get more to make their lives better. There's Danton. There's a story about Danton where, if you notice, he's got kind of a big head and neck. He was kind of a big, heavy, bulky guy. And apparently the first time they tried to execute him, his head would not fit into the slot where the guillotine goes. And they had to create a kind of a larger hole in the guillotine. So he actually was supposed to get executed one day, and then they had to wait till they could fix the guillotine to make his head fit into it. The Thermidorian reaction. Okay, now this is where the French Revolution, if you haven't thought it's weird, this is where it gets really weird. One of the things that they're going to do is they're going to create a whole new calendar. They don't want to do anything of the past, so they get rid of the Roman calendar. And Thermidor is actually July. So what happens is the July reaction, if you want to call it that. And the new bourgeois, which are middle class, started the insurrection, which is an uprising, of Pereire, year 3. And what all that means is they're not going to use the old numbering system. So instead of 1792, that is going to be year 0, and then they start from there. And so year 3 is 1795. So they're going to come up with their own calendar and their own years. All the months and years were changed to coincide with the start of the revolution in 1792. And that year became 0. The new bourgeois formed the constitution of the year 3, and the Directory now ruled. So now this is a group of people now ruling. And it lasted about 4.5 years, 1795 to 1799. And this is a picture of that taking place, the Thermidorian reaction. And again, you see blood on the streets. You see smoke from gunpowder. Weaknesses of the Directory. There were weaknesses. It had a very narrow social base. And what that means is it only included people from like one class. It did not include other people. It included only people that were from one class, which would be that, the bourgeois. Now, when the military success happens, that is going to keep them going. If you don't have the military success, you are not going to keep this revolution going. The legislative assembly had 2 chambers, so kind of like ours, like I said, Senate and the House. Enemies existed on both the left and the right. Okay, left and right refers to the political spectrum. Left is liberal, right is conservative. And the royalists, so this becomes a 5th group. They wanted a king, and they formed something called the Clichy Club, which was to try to get a king. Led by Babou, French name, the Conspiracy of Equals wanted a kind of early socialism. So you have all kinds of things going on here. This fellow Babou, he wanted France to become basically a socialist country. All right, March 1797, the first truly free election in France. Successful candidate. What I mean by that too, the first truly free election in France is you could vote for who you want and everybody could vote. Successful candidates were constitutional monarchs. So this is what they chose. They wanted a king or queen, but they wanted a constitution with it. And this was hard for the Republicans to handle because the Republicans wanted an elected leader. They wanted the ballot box. All right, now comes the rise of Napoleon. Napoleon's success in war gave him great power. He's got a great story. He rises from being a corporal, all the way up, colonel, captain, and finally a general. And the Directory knew Napoleon controlled the army. They asked him for help. He made sure the coup d'etat of Fructidor was successful. Fructidor, September 4th, 1797. This would be year 5 on their scale. Coup d'etat is a military takeover. And so Napoleon sides with the Directory. He helps them take over power. The anti-royalists took over the government, making sure a Bourbon king was not put on the throne. So the Clichy Club and the royalists are going to be arrested, run off, executed, etc. And Napoleon's armies crushed any opposition. This wasn't even close. Napoleon was brilliant as far as military tactics goes. And he concluded the Treaty of Campo Formio, which took Austria out of the coalition. Austria was probably the main country in the coalition that, if they're in it, they have a chance to defeat France. Otherwise, they don't. And when they drop out, Austria, remember, was a military country. And he returned to Paris a hero. Comes back and he gets throngs meeting him, applauding him, and they have a big parade and all that kind of stuff. And there's the very romantic portrait, picture, painting of him on horseback. Territorial reconstruction of Europe takes place. Okay, Napoleon has taken over almost all of Europe or else made them into allies. And soon Italy, Switzerland, and the Holy Roman Empire are broken up and come under French domination. So France controls what is today Italy, Switzerland, and Holy Roman Empire, what's left of the German states outside of Prussia and Austria. A second coalition against Napoleon's armies is formed. So again, coalition, countries band together, try to put up enough men to fight against France. And this is just a map showing the coalitions. You see the colors are countries that are fighting together. The coup d'etat of Brumaire occurs 11/9/1799. So Brumaire is October. So we have another military takeover. And the idea of maintaining the republic as a free or constitutional government was given up. It's not going to be free. It's not going to be constitutional. It's going to be ruled by a group. The office of the consulate is formed. You might call it like the prime minister. And Napoleon is going to be appointed as the first consul. Remember, he helps the Directory get power. They're going to want him to be in charge. And he became the last of the enlightened despots. Enlightened again, educated, wanting change, wanting progress, despot meaning one person rule. And there's one of the famous pictures of Napoleon. By the way, the reason he always had his hand in his shirt, I don't know if any of you know that, but he had psoriasis, a skin disease, and he didn't like to have people see it on his hand. So that's why he hid his hand. And because he did that, it becomes a fashion throughout Europe. Another new constitution, I've lost track. I think it's about 3. But it's a make-believe of parliamentary institutions was created. He does the same thing kind of that Hitler does later, is he makes it look like it's an elected parliament, but it was really show, it didn't really have any power. And Napoleon entrenched himself by promising and maintaining peace. So this is how he gets people to listen to him. He controls the army. He's got the most powerful army in Europe, and they promise and maintain peace. And he kept internal order through a powerful and centralized political machine. He had agents all over the place. So, it was, again, very similar to the Nazis in that you couldn't say anything against him or the government because you didn't know who was an agent. He put them all over, even in small towns, to help keep things centralized. And disturbers of the new order were put down ruthlessly. So if you were anti-Napoleon, get ready to go to jail. Get ready to, be put on trial. And then this is probably the smartest thing he did. He made peace with the church in 1801, the Concordat with Pius VII, the Pope. And here Napoleon didn't want to get rid of religion. And so he makes peace with the Pope, and now you're going to bring the church back together. Instead of the church that supports the revolution and the church that supports Rome, he's going to try to put them back together. And there's Pope Pius. Probably the most important thing that Napoleon did socially in Europe was the Napoleonic Code. With peace and order established, he now turned to the fields of law and order, law and administration. And citizens were able to rise in government strictly by service of their own abilities. So government service is going to be based on ability, not who you are. And see, that's how he was able to rise. So that's why he did that. Public financing, taxation were also changed. Instead of what caused the revolution in the beginning, the king needing money and calling the 3 estates together, the Estates General, to try to raise taxes, he's going to start raising taxes or putting taxes on everyone. And see, in the old system, the nobles, the first and second estate did not pay taxes. Only the third estate did. So we come up with what's called the Civil Code or Napoleonic Code. And all citizens were equal under law, and they all had the same civil rights. And probably the most important thing here, he codified laws. In other words, they wrote them down, they had them organized, and again, everybody is treated equal, not just, okay, the leader doesn't like me, so you get a bad deal. The revolution ends. What the Third Estate wanted in 1789 was now both codified and enforced. And the consulate became the empire, and Napoleon had himself elected emperor for life by another plebiscite. Plebiscite is everybody voting. And Napoleon wanted the public to approve of it. So he had himself elected emperor, which I know it sounds weird because it's not a democratic position. He then crowned himself emperor. Now, this is where he goes too far. Usually you had a bishop, somebody from the church, even the Pope, crown an emperor. And in this case, the bishop has the crown in his hand, and Napoleon takes it from him, puts it on his own head in this service, and turns a lot of people off. Napoleon had everything going, everybody loved him, he was on top of the world. And then this happened, and then turned a lot of people off. They thought he had a little bit too much megalomania there. Here is the picture of him putting the crown on his own head. Okay, that kind of ends it. Now Napoleon is going to rule for a while, but that is the end of the French Revolution, and Napoleon does try to expand France even further, and we will talk about that later. But please do your summary now, and make sure you look back at that essential question and summarize.